Fear Zone, your channel of horror stories. Good evening everyone, and today's story is The Cursed Farm. So now, let's go to the story. Well, my name is Orlando. This story happened to me in the region of the city of Pelotas, which is in Brazil. This event was in the year 1987, and at that time I was 31 years old. And to begin the story, in the region where I lived was a rural area, where there were many farms and ranches, and even some villages, and this region had a large farm, where they had coffee plantations, and raised pigs, chickens, and cattle in large quantities, and this farm had some employees. Well, many people in the region wanted to work on this farm, but so far so good. But the fact is that I learned, through a friend who worked on this farm, that from 1 hour to the next, the caretaker of this farm left his job and disappeared, and never came back, and nobody knew what happened to this man. And as I was unemployed at that time, I went to talk to the foreman of this farm, where the caretaker had disappeared. Finally, by luck I got this job. Anyway, soon I started working, and a few months passed. Everything was normal, until one day in the morning, when I went to feed the animals, I saw that there was a large amount of dead farm animals on the farm, and several chickens died, and some horses and cows, and worst of all, it seemed that it was a supernatural thing that had happened, because these animals were very healthy, and were not sick, and also, there was no sign of attack from any predatory animal. Simply these animals appeared dead for no reason. The foreman of this farm told me not to worry about it, and to continue my work, and forget about this event. But after this story of the deaths of the animals, more than 2 months passed. One day, I was looking for some keys that I had lost around the farm, and it was already late at night, finally, and I was walking near the boss's house, which was inside the farm, who was the owner of the farm, and I heard that he was talking to someone. I was curious and stopped by the window, and soon I saw that my boss was arguing and talking with a very old man there inside his house, and my boss was saying, "Not now, not now," and it seemed that he had some debt with the old man. After a while, I became afraid that someone would see me walking around there, so I ended up leaving my boss' house, and I went back to my residence and went to sleep. But when the day dawned, I went to work around the farm. But what happened is that once again, another disgrace happened on the farm, because many cows and horses died, and also chickens on the farm. But to my surprise, it was the same as the other time, without any predator animal attack, without any attack marks. The animals simply appeared dead from one day to the next, without any explanation. The farm foreman told me not to worry about this problem. I was just supposed to help him put the bodies of the animals in the truck, to be taken to bury them. But this time, besides the death of the animals, more misfortune began to happen on the farm, because the boss's wife and his son, who lived on the farm, got a serious disease. They were between life and death, and with all this misfortune, I didn't understand why my boss still didn't bring a priest or a pastor to the farm to expel something bad and supernatural that could be haunting the farm, because it was an evil that was repeating itself there, because it was the second time that the deaths of animals happened in a strange and identical way. But a few weeks later, after this occurrence, another tragedy happened on the farm, because my boss suddenly appeared dead hanging from a rope tied to a tree on his farm. It was a very strange thing. How could someone so rich have taken his own life like that? Because the police made several investigations on the farm, and the forensics found that the farmer himself, he took the rope by himself, and went to the tree and took his own life. But what happened is that after my boss died, a little time passed, and his wife and his son, who were sick and almost dying. From 1 hour to another, they were cured of their serious illness and went back to their normal lives, and it even seemed like magic that the boss's wife and son were cured, but it seemed that they had got rid of some spell connected to the boss's death. However, what happened was that when my boss died, a big legal battle began over the inheritance of the man, and then the land and the cattle and the animals were sold by his wife and his children and relatives, and with this, the employees ended up losing their jobs. I also ended up losing my job at the farm, and I ended up going back to the village where I lived. In all this, a few months passed, and one day, I was in a bar drinking beer, and I suddenly saw an old man come into the bar, whom I had seen somewhere before, and I soon remembered that this old man was the same man who was talking to my boss when I looked through the window of my boss's window one day on the farm. And I didn't even need to call the old man to talk. He already came to my table, and soon we started talking, and I asked him where he knew my former boss from, who had taken his own life. This old man told me that he was the old farm caretaker and left the farm. And the old man said that he also knew my former boss for a long time, since he was a young and poor man. Then the old man said that he helped my boss become a rich man and buy several lands and farms and have a lot of money. I started to get suspicious about the whole story, but I just listened to the old caretaker talk. But I asked him if he knew anything about why the animals on the farm suddenly died without being hurt or having any kind of disease. The old farm manager said that my former employer had overdue a certain debt, and he did not want to pay this debt, and while he was not paying this debt, his animals and his closest relatives would die, because his account was overdue. It is as if the former employer did not want to pay his debt, and then the animals were killed, and his relatives got sick, until it happened that the ex-boss died. And then everything went back to normal, and his relatives were suddenly cured of their illness. And this was actually only part of the curse, and the animals suddenly stopped dying, because now the curse on the farm was over. But this old man, besides this strange conversation, he began to propose a deal with me, and he asked me if I wanted to be a millionaire and rich like the former boss, and have everything good that life offered, and the old man said, who was easy to achieve this, and that I just needed to give something I had of value. Of course I did not want. I thought it was a joke, and soon left this old man sitting alone at the bar table, and I went to the barkeep's counter to pay the bills. When I was leaving the bar, I looked back and saw this old man touching his hat, which he wore on his head, and it seemed that it was my impression, because I saw that this old man had 2 small horns on his forehead. I was scared by what I saw, but I looked again, where the old man was sitting, and I realized that he had disappeared from the place. It was like he had suddenly disappeared, like magic, and it was an amazing thing that I had seen there, because for me, what that old man was doing was a deal with me, and with those 2 horns on that man's forehead, he was the bad thing from hell himself. Then I started thinking about the whole story of my boss, and this old caretaker on the farm, and then I connected this whole story of this curse, that it actually happened. The bad thing was disguised as an old caretaker. My former boss would have sold his soul to get rich, and when the time came to pay with his life, he did not want to pay this debt, and during this time, while he did not pay, the farm was under a curse, until the boss paid his debt with his life. Well, that was my conclusion to this whole story, and of course, I don't really like to remember that old farmer talking to me in that bar, because it gives me the creeps to remember that moment with that old devil. I know this story is heavy, but this was my real horror story, and I hope that this experience of mine serves as an example to people not to want to be rich the easy way like that, because the charge will come someday. Good night. Well guys, if you liked the story, subscribe to our channel Fear Zone and leave a like to help. Until the next video. Fear Zone, your channel of real horror stories. And now, let's go to today's story, which is from Mr. Luiz, and this happened to him in the city of Poços de Caldas, which is in Brazil, and at that time, that was in the year 1990, Mr. Luiz was 46 years old. And everything starts like this. I lived at that time with my family in a village of my city, which was a rural village. But what happened once was that one of my neighbors moved from my neighborhood because he had got a very good job in another city, and so he left his house to rent and went away from our neighborhood. With this passed about a month, and a man who was about 35 years old and was single ended up renting this residence of my former neighbor, who had gone to another city. One day, I found this new neighbor walking down the street in the village and talked a little with him, and ended up knowing that this man came to live in our village, to work in a factory at dawn until dawn. Well, and what I know about this guy too, is that he was a guy who talked little and didn't like to answer many questions. But a few days passed, and I started hearing some strange stories in my neighborhood that a person had seen a kind of demon in the woods, and that this creature made a roaring noise with a deep and scary sound, and other people also said it was a werewolf. And with all this talk, neighbors and acquaintances of the neighborhood avoided going out on the streets at night, and because of many reports told by people, all residents feared this creature. But what happened is that I noticed that my new neighbor didn't care about this werewolf story that people said they had seen around the village, and he still, at night, my new neighbor, walked the streets, which was in case he went to work, and he only came back early in the morning, when the day was clearing up. But the strange thing is that this man didn't leave his house, not even on his days off. He was more locked inside the house, and it seemed that he was hiding from people. But one day, a resident of my street said that he saw this new neighbor come in the morning, passing by on the street, and he was walking with a limp, and his face was swollen and bruised. After I learned about this, the conversation spread that he had been attacked by the beast, because this neighbor was the only guy who sometimes walked around the village late at night. I was worried about the guy, because he didn't have any relatives nearby. So I went to his house to find out what had happened to this neighbor of mine. Then I saw him arriving at his house, and went to talk to him, and this neighbor told me that when he got off the bus to leave, 2 bandits robbed him, and ended up beating him, and I noticed that this man was really hurt, and as this guy did not want to talk to me much, I left this guy there, and went away. But I did not believe this story that the bandits beat him. There was some mystery in it all. One day, I went to a bar near my house, and stayed there drinking until about 10 p.m., and when I left the bar, a friend of mine who lived in the same neighborhood accompanied me, going away together with me. And while me and my partner from the bar were walking down the road, we saw my new neighbor on the street, and this guy stopped at a certain point of the dirt road, and he went into a dark bush, but my partner from the bar agreed that we would follow the guy through the woods, because this new neighbor was a man who seemed to have many secrets. So we went after the guy who went into the dark woods to see what he was doing there at that time of night. We entered this forest and went after my neighbor, and after chasing him for about 10 minutes, we saw that he turned on the flashlight near a tree, and he stood there. We were 15 meters away from this man. We even thought that he was going to use some kind of drugs, but then this man looked like he started to get sick, and he also took his clothes off his body, and he was naked, and soon this guy started to say some words, like this: "I don't want to turn this, I don't want to turn this," and he kept repeating these phrases over and over again. We were startled at that moment, because he looked like he was summoning something supernatural. But suddenly this man fell to the ground, and he started rolling around on the ground, and struggling, and it looked like he was having some kind of epileptic seizure, but as the light from the flashlight was falling on the ground, you could see a little bit by the brightness of the light that this guy was getting hairier and hairier, and the most frightening thing is that his eyes were like a yellowish light that went on and off, and it was a very strange thing indeed. And when this man lifted you off the ground and stood up, I almost froze with fear, because what we were seeing was already a creature, half human and half animal, because that guy's mouth already had a snout like a dog's, and his ears were very big. In this hour of danger, my friend who was there with me ended up gesturing with his hands for us to get out of there quietly. While the werewolf finished his transformation, we left the forest in a big hurry, and as soon as we got to the dirt road, we started running to our houses, and I, already at my residence, kept looking through the window in the direction of my new neighbor's house. Because he was the werewolf. The fact is that the creature that he transformed himself into did not appear at dawn on my street. But when dawn came, this guy arrived at his house normally as a man, and then he locked himself in his residence. But when the afternoon came, I went to find my friend, who saw the creature in the woods with me. I talked to him, and we came to the conclusion that it was better to stay put until we see what we would do to solve this case of terror, to catch this guy by surprise sometime in the woods, and to capture this werewolf. Well, but my colleague from the bar had already told his wife of what happened, and so complicated, because his wife was very gossipy, and she would spread this talk about the werewolf throughout the neighborhood. Anyway, maybe because this neighbor of mine lived in a strange way, people might believe this story from my friend's wife, even though this story was true. Well, and after a few days of this event, the whole neighborhood practically already knew more or less that my new neighbor had some connection with the creature that walked through the woods at dawn, and as people spoke and distrust of the residents, and this guy who turned werewolf locked himself even more inside his house, and no longer left the streets during the day. And the nights, when this guy went out to the streets, he stayed 3 to 4 days missing, and then appeared and hid in his house. But during this time also, I would get worried about the people in my neighborhood, and I would look all night at this neighbor's house to try to see anything strange around there. I also left my shotgun in the way, and prepared myself for the worst, in case the neighbor appeared nearby as a werewolf. But other than that, for a few days, a pickup truck belonging to a farmer started to pass by my street a few times during the day, and during the night, this pickup truck driver would drive his vehicle down the street, and he would pass looking at the residence of my werewolf neighbor, and I even think that my new neighbor noticed this, and he ended up disappearing from my village and never showed up again. After a few days, I saw a moving truck at the werewolf's house, and they moved all the furniture out of his house. For me, this was expected, because if he stayed longer in my neighborhood, more people would discover his secret, and he would run the risk of his life. And I also learned, with the passing of time, that my story about the werewolf reached some Kaipiras in the region, where the werewolf would have invaded their properties to get chickens and other livestock. But the Kaipiras let the dogs loose on the creature and beat the werewolf with a stick, and the beast ended up running away from the place all bruised, and because of this, my neighbor would show up bruised in the neighborhood in the morning. This truck that passed by my street belonged to a Kaipira, who was after the guy who turned into a werewolf, and all this, was a friend of mine who already knew my story, who told me this other part of the story. And of course, after many people knew that the new neighbor had some relation with the creature of the night, the guy disappeared from the village, and with this, I heard no more about werewolf appearances. But in this story, I took a life lesson. I still suspect to this day that if you walk around in the woods at night, a werewolf may appear and attack you, because I saw that these creatures exist. Well, folks, and that was my supernatural experience that I had. And if you like the story, subscribe to the channel, like, and share this video. Until the next haunted story.